How important are fundamental movement skills, like running, jumping, throwing and catching, to the performance of our more specific Gaelic game skills, particularly right up at the elite end of adult intercounty GAA? In an ideal world, we'd mainly focus on these fundamental movement skills in our younger players, say 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But what about teenage years or as adults? Today's guest has drawn on all of his experiences. Primary school principal, lecturer in PE, senior hurling club coach, senior intercounty camogie coach and manager, and development squad coach. From his time and experiences spent across these different roles, he noticed just how important the fundamental movement skills were and sought to set up an intervention to try and improve them in a group of development squad players. We're going to dive into this today to see what can be done to actually improve fundamental movement skills in the teenage years, what knock-on effect this has on the sport-specific skills of the players. Are there windows of opportunity at specific ages where we should be focusing on fundamental movement skills more than other ages? What knock-on benefits it has to general movement skills around the pitch? How can increase and improve retention and participation of players as they progress through the teenage years and are more likely to drop out? And my pack is full of practical recommendations that coaches across the ages can use with their teams pretty much immediately. Really interesting conversation with Brian O'Boyle, who some of you may know as Pam Ireland on Twitter or other social media channels, where he's put out loads of fundamental movement skill-based resources. So Brian, have you finished up celebrating the All-Ireland 8, or are there still lads racing international athletes up the street outside the window from you there?
I think with club championship just around the corner, the celebrations are still strong, but I think divisional championships start this weekend, so I'd say the lads will be back at it shortly enough.
Yeah, trying to get maybe one training session in before you go out into the first round of the North or the South, wherever it might be. So Brian, we're going looking today at, I suppose it's a mixture of some fundamental movement skills based stuff, some sport specific skills based stuff, but also how it applies to broader camogie / hurling, because it would carry across. I think you're uniquely positioned to look at all this and that through your Pam Ireland profiles. You've done an awful lot of stuff on fundamental movement skills, specifically with primary school PE. You do a lot of coaching of hurling and camogie yourself. Was it true, looking at both of those, you said there must be more of a link here, and that's why you went on to study it in a bit more of a formal academic setting?
Yeah, I suppose, John, like my background as primary teacher, primary principal, so I wouldn't have the huge knowledge and skill acquisition coming into this kind of field when I did at the start. I was manager to Tip Senior Camogies in 15, 16 and 17, and I suppose in 15 across the board in Tipperary there was with the different squads from minor up, there was a lot of cruciate ligament injuries happened. And I suppose we were at the end of our first year, and I just kind of said, is there something in this? Do you know what I mean? To have that, and they all have different age groups and training and so on. And we decided with our S&C team, so we had Patrick Lowry and Maggie O'Grady and Sinead Costello under the tutelage of Rob Cassidy at the time as our S&C team, to kind of looking at jumping and landing specifics and change of direction, and implementing a program around that in our second year to see how we got on. Now, I wanted to say that the first year all those cruciates weren't with the same group, and they were across the whole gamut of teams that were going on for Tipperary, but we did very much in that, where we actually focused on the landing and jumping, and how we should jump and land, and how we should turn and things like that. Now, we had no cruciate ligaments, we had no serious injuries the following 2 years after we started doing that, because we followed it up the following year as well. So obviously then the nature of jumping and landing being fundamental movement skills and something I'd use in primary school, and coming out of the camogie at senior level, I had always said I'd give a couple of years back to the academy, sub-academy level before finishing up altogether, just to bring back down what you've learned at the highest level and bring back and implement it with your younger players. So that's where the interest came in saying, look, was there something deeper in fundamental movement skills in terms of how we perform them? And is there a lasting benefit, not just to being able to access sports skills, but just into staying healthy?
Just an overview there, I know I've done a video, and if anyone follows you, they'll know an awful lot about fundamental movement skills, but you give us a brief overview of what they are first.
Yeah, so we have our fundamental movement skills as they're in the Irish context contextualized around the world. In somewhere like America, to be more of an emphasis placed on throwing and catching, simply because of the American football and sports like that. But in Ireland, we have our locomotor skills and our manipulative skills. So our locomotor skills are jumping, skipping, and so on, dodging, and our manipulative skills, then our object control skills are our throwing, catching, or striking a ball with our hand, or striking a ball with an implement. And then we have the landing, balance and landing skills as well. So they're and then we have the overall set of maybe 12 or 15 skills that we look at in an Irish context.
And something you'd have been very aware of as a primary school principal, obviously doing some elements of PE in your training, and like when you were teaching before you were a principal, you've seen then the links between some of those and how they carry up to more the sport-specific skills. Have you ever noticed any testing or seen that, and even doing your lit review for this, around fundamental movement skills testing in adults? Is there anything on that? It just occurred to me there.
Not that I'm aware of, because we were looking at the adolescents and 14-year-olds. There's some up into the mid, like I know Oxtel, for example, did a study in 2015 where they were slightly older, but nothing really beyond that, from what I can see. And I suppose the full value of fundamental movement skill assessment would be in a kind of a longitudinal study where you might assess them a couple of times through the life course, and we tried to kind of achieve that with this by doing a snapshot at the beginning and a snapshot at the end after an intervention.
So you looked at fundamental movement skills in 2 under 14 said development squads in Camogie. Obviously you can't share what counties they were. See what their level of fundamental movement skills are, what their level of some sport specific skills, and we'll touch on those in a second, and then look to do an intervention with one of the development squads. Is that it?
That's it, yeah.
Why under 14? Did you feel that's where they should be at a level that the fundamental movement skills should be somewhat proficient, as should some of the sport specific skills? That's why they've come through a stage now where they should be able to perform all these, but there is still room for improvement in them.
I suppose a couple of reasons, John. One, evidence and studies tell us that during the transition stages in second level, that's where a lot of people drop out of the sport. So these would have been transitioning into secondary school, really, at 13, 14 years of age, and maybe have just completed their first year there. It is the first stage really where that kind of academy, sub-academy structure where you get a cohort of players, from right across a county and different club experiences and so on up to there. It's also their PHV, they're in maybe after experiencing or just about to experience their growth spurt. So I felt it was a nice kind of opportunity to see the effects of that without it being recorded in the study, because that in itself would have been a study on its own. But I suppose it was there, and it was something that we were conscious of. We also find that, at the beginning of this study, we would have done a questionnaire, and 86% of the girls involved in both squads were multi-sport exposed, so they were doing sports outside of Camogie as well. So that was really good, because the evidence would tell us as they go on into the years, they start maybe dropping away sports and concentrating on one or the other, or narrowing it down to a smaller field of sports. So they were the main reasons. I suppose as well, anecdotally, some PE teachers would say that they find that children find it hard to do the PE now coming into secondary school because of a lack of proficiency in fundamental movement skills, and they're finding they have to go back to address those before they can kind of move on with the curriculum as it is. So I think that's another side there,
Well, as a PE teacher, I'd completely concur with that one. Based on your lit review, but also stuff you've looked at in general, I know it's something I spoke about with P.T. Shaw before, the link between the fundamental movement skills and the sport specific skills. Do you think the girls who play a lot of sports, do they play a lot of sports because they're good, they have a decent grasp of fundamental movement skills and therefore can apply them to more sports, or because they play a lot of sports they develop more fundamental movement skills, or is it somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, this is a question we had with, I was blessed to have a research team, supervising team of Dr. Cian O'Neill, Dr. Con Burns and Dr. A. Collin in MTU, and it was a conversation that emanated a good bit. Are they good at sports because they've strong FMS, or are they strong FMS and therefore good at sport? Which way does it work? And I suppose it is hard to tell without maybe taking a snapshot a couple of different times through a year and seeing where you're going. And as I said, doing it longitudinally. as it turned out, if you remember there at the study, though you would expect that they might be stronger at object control skills, but they actually weren't. It was locomotor skills. So you might say some of the locomotor skills would be less, I would say, influencing on the execution of the GAA, striking and hand passing and jab lifting. You know, you would think that the object control would be more when you're talking about striking an object, but it turned out that we found a greater link between being able to perform the locomotor skills and the sport specific. So that might kind of give a deeper insight into the link between the two, you know.
Yeah, that's fair. One point, if you don't agree with this, or if people listen don't agree with this, don't throw it on Brian, this is my own opinion. I often find in camogie, you're more likely to be a better or more effective player if you're more like athletic and can move around the pitch better. Whereas I think in hurling, a really skillful player can get by without being quite as athletic, largely because men can hit the ball further and females are just a little bit smaller as people in general on a bigger pitch, and that's why I think being fitter and running around more can actually cover over for a lack of some of the skills. But that's just my own thought. I don't expect people to agree with that one. Jumping into the study, so this was a 20-week study looking at a development squad. Was this just once a week? Were they training once a week with their squads, or was it a couple of times?
At different stages. So you're guided by the National Development Plan for Camogie in relation to squads. So you are allowed a certain period of time where you can train twice a week, coming up to certain blitzes. They have maybe 5 blitzes in the year. So coming up to the national blitz, you are allowed to have a little bit more access to them. But for the most part, you're allowed to train once a week, and they continue on with their club training and other sports during that period.
And were you able to record how much overall training in general they were doing in a typical week?
Not really, only anecdotally. Again, in terms of finding it, because we would find that it depended on the individual club units as to what they were doing, you know. And then if they were doing football and the football and camogie were the same club, they would maybe alternate nights and would combine together. So it was a little bit awkward trying to track that individually.
Yeah, that would be a nightmare, really. And 20-week intervention, was it 20 weeks because that is typically how long the development squad season lasts, or the most evidence is around 20 weeks being the most effective, or somewhere in between?
No, there was no science really attached to it. Only it was the time that we were ready to go that brought us up to the, you know, so they had you at the beginning, everybody was assessed for FMS, and then outside of that, you were selecting your panel of players and refining that down. This is important to say that any of the results in the FMS or the skills test did not influence who was, you know, this was completely separate on that, and it's important to emphasize that. So by the time we were sort of ready to go, it was sort of March in terms of pitches, and they finished at the end of August, so it just fitted into a 20-week zone. But like, you were looking for something sustained and something, you know, that would we had a natural endpoint there, so we worked towards that rather than just going for an 8 or a 10-week one, you know.
Yeah, good. And so the intervention group then, the group you looked to develop the fundamental movement skills with, what did like generally sessions look like, and was there any difficulty in getting the coaches of the development squads on board with it, or like changing? Like, they might have had these plans for, we're going to do all this specific camogie stuff, or we're going to get really fit, and you're coming with, look, it'd actually be great for them if they got better at hopping and jumping. Any eyebrows raised there, or?
No, look, I was very lucky. I had Philly Ryan and Carmen Bradshaw and Sarah Devan, Rachel Hogan, Mike Galvin. They were coaches. They're with me, and I hope I haven't left any in, Marie Corbett as well. And they all came from different varying experiences with different sports. And it was a meeting that we had prior to the study, and we said this could not do anything but benefit the players in the long run. So we kind of said, look, and as it turned out, that particular group had a very successful year, but we said it wasn't really our main goal in that year. It was, as it should be all the time, really to develop them with the longer term goal in mind, you know. So we would have tailored our sessions, would have been slightly longer as a result, maybe than the norm, but not too much. Simply because we only had them once a week, and we had to get in our intervention based stuff. So it would be a station teaching where I would kind of give the guys, look, this is what you're working on this week, this is the key points, and then I'd rotate along with them and be like the 5 things on a dice, 5 circles on a dice there for the number 5. That's sort of what we worked at. Each of them were a station, and they rotated. and that might take a half an hour, and then we go into our game specific stuff,
And the 5 stations, were they like a fundamental movement skill per station, or maybe 3 fundamental movement skills, 2 more Camogie specific ones?
It would be like that. So it would be 2. We would revise one each week, and we would introduce a new one each week in relation to those, and then there would be some Camogie specific skills at the other stations. We would have had, in order to make sure that we addressed all the skills, we did a matrix whereby we said which skill was the primary goal that week and which was the secondary goal, which ones were addressed, so we could look at the end and say, yeah, they were all evenly addressed as best as we possibly could. Like some of them would really challenge you. So for instance, the fundamental movement skill of rolling, it's a difficult enough one to combine into something, but we actually did rolling and dodging. So the girls were rolling slitters while the others were running across and trying to dodge it. So they were getting used to stepping off their left, stepping off their right. And then we'd rotate the girls. So the ones that were dodging were then rolling the balls. So I suppose it kind of challenged us as coaches to come up with stuff that was relevant, but actually addressed the skill as well. And then also keeping the Camogie element involved / hurling.
Good, yeah. And was there, so within a particular fundamental movement skill, was there progression of that skill over the course of how often you could fit it in? Like, was there time for that with how many skills you have to address with a once a week contact?
So are you talking about the Camogie there, Dan, or the fundamental movement skill?
No, the fundamental movement, sorry.
On a movement skill, yeah. So yeah, no, it was always a case that you try and get back to it over a period of time, and even at our so we might have a blitz at the weekend. On top of that, we would address it there again as part of our warm up, and we try and include it. So something like jumping and landing, that was something that was kind of incorporated into every single warm up we did pretty much all the time. Whether it was rotational jumps and landing, and the girls used to love the language. Like we used to actually. At times we wouldn't do the jump. We'd just focus on landing and how we'd land and absorbing the landing, because some of the evidence we had was that, I want to go into too many details, but, girls widen at the pelvis and the hips as they get older, which kind of exudes an inordinate amount of pressure down through the knees when they land. And if they're landing with locked out knees, we felt that that's where we were getting issues. So we were trying to get them to absorb their landing. So it was drop to the pot was one of the sayings we used to have, where they just basically absorb a landing, and we would do that ad nauseum just to get them used to that. And then we'd throw in the jump and maybe jump from 1 foot landing on 2, jumping from 2 feet to landing on 1 and stuff like that. And all that's easily incorporated, as you well know, into warm-up movement mechanics.
Yeah, because you're developing the skill of the jump and the land and the hop and land, but you're also developing a lot of eccentric strength through all of the landing bits there. And the control group then, that was just another development squad, and they continued on with their normal, we'll say, traditional training.
They did, yeah. Kind of game-focused training as opposed to focusing in on the fundamental movement skills as we would have done.
Were you able to observe any of those, or even get training logs or diaries or anything? Or?
No, I didn't. I did see some of what they were doing, and it was I won't say traditional, but what I mean by traditional is that it was the sport focus as opposed to any other focus.
And last bit before we start jumping into some of the finals was, you did some Camogie-specific or sports-specific tests. What were they? How did you do them, and how were they scored, say?
So there was 3 skills. We observed a number of matches to kind of assess what skills were most used in the game of Camogie. Now, there's studies out there, but they weren't specific to Camogie. So we looked at elite matches, which were All-Ireland semi-finals and finals, and then we looked at under 16 intercounty games, which were in the level directly above this. And we found that the skills that were most executed in the game were the jab lift, the strike, and the hand pass. And they were the 3 skills that we zoned in on. Now, as I said, I was so lucky with the supervisory team that we had. Everybody recognised that you can strike a ball in a number of different ways to a number of different targets, and depending on whether you're striking for clearance or striking for a score or a 20-yard pass. The same with the hand pass and the jab lift. We were looking at it as a 2-handed jab lift. And reacting to a stimulus, so they get a call and they had to move to that cone, So we didn't want them just to be static practices. We wanted them to be representative somewhat of how they're executed in the game. But also we needed to be able to mark and assess the actual execution of the skill, not how well somebody moved to a ball or how well they struck on the move. Do you know what I mean? We were looking at those basics. So we scored them in a kind of a Likert scale then, 1 to 5, 0 or 0 to 5, 0 being a failed execution and 5 being the best possible execution of the skill. So, for example, the striking skill was whereby they were striking to a target 20 meters away. They started with their head down and they reacted to a call. So it was like getting a call in a game from a player to pass the ball. So it was reacting to that stimulus of that. The jab lift then was they were running, they get to a certain point and they get a call of a cone. There was 3 balls in a line and they go blue, yellow, red, and they get the call to go to yellow. So, and it was in the instruction that they had to move at a meaningful pace and a pace, close to what they would attack the ball in the game. And then, as I said, when we recorded every single skill execution across the 2 counties, so at the beginning, you're talking thousands here of different skill executions because each person did them 6 times because they were brand new skills. We wanted them not to be tied down by unfamiliarity. Do you know what I mean? By the fact that they were doing them, so they got loads of opportunities to practice them. And then every one of them was scored retrospectively by looking back at the videos. And from there, then we came up with the different executions, So I don't want to get too bogged down, I suppose, in the technical, but say one of the things that would have been a common occurrence that we would have noticed with the girls in the jab lift where the 2 hands were very close to the top of the hurley, which meant the hurley was very steep coming into the ball and the ball would go up into the air. So we made one of the scores there to rise the ball in as efficient a manner as possible. So as close to the ground and catch it as close to the ground as possible.
That's really good because a lot of that sport-specific stuff, it's very hard to measure objectively because you're there's the technical execution of skill, but there's then the technical execution of the skill within a game context and the slight modifications you have to make around how you do it. So while it's important for a study to do these, there are I wouldn't be saying to everyone go out and use these tests to immediately assess all your players, see who are the best or who are the weakest, because it's very research focused. It's not to rank players or anything like that here.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, as I said, I was very lucky at the group, the supervisors that I had. I was able to bounce these over and back and come back with with our inter-rater and so intra-rater reliability in the testing going on, and able to come back and rediscuss and say, look, actually notice this has emanated as a trend. I've just given you one there for the lift. Another one for the strike would have been, the strike actually wasn't too bad, but you were trying to get them to strike it into the area where the person at the other end could catch it. Because obviously anybody could hit a ball 40 yards, but actually controlling the strike to somebody was an important part of what we were trying to assess there.
Well, yeah, there's nice elements of realism around it there. Just putting my researcher hat on for a minute, recording and scoring all the fundamental movement skills and all the sport-specific skills. How difficult did you find the repetition and everything of all of that?
Yeah, look, again, I was very lucky with an undergrad team and all the lads that I mentioned earlier. They all helped out with videos and scoring and all that, and we all did the training as part of it. And then I would have done some training with them. It would not have been possible without the team that I had. I mean, there was 12 fundamental movement skills assessed there across 240 people at the beginning, and then you go to doing it again. Then you had maybe 6 executions of each one of those 3 sport-specific skills across the same amount of people. And thankfully at the end, so I suppose that's what took so long in terms of the study coming to fruition. I graduated there in 2024 and it started in kind of 2019, was just the amount of data and videos that had to be reviewed and re-reviewed was huge.
I think I was chatting to Stephen Bean at the ISESA conference. He's a student currently looking at the use of AI and scoring the TGMD2 test, which I think would actually speed up the process of doing a lot of fundamental movement skill-based research, because the scoring of testing is so time-consuming and labour-intensive. As soon as someone does it once, I'm never doing a study like this again. So I think if we could shorten that a little bit, it would help us take a bit more of an in-depth look at that. We'll start looking at findings now, Brian. Do you want to just give us a few of the key bits that jumped out to you as you were going through it, and we'll start digging into a few of the notes I've made out here to go a bit deeper on some.
Yeah, so I suppose, look, in relation to the improvements, everybody to the improvements that were made. And so actually I'll tackle the baseline first. So maybe people would feel that, because these were involved in sport, and I don't like using the word elite when you're talking about 14-year-olds, but at that level, they're at the higher standard of players at that specific age group. You'd expect maybe they might be a little bit better at the fundamental movement skills, but actually the scores were almost identical to those found in Philpott and McGrain and O'Brien studies with almost an age match population. Now, in those studies, there's no mention. I'm sure there's people within their studies who were doing sport as well. So it's hard to say that it's not non-sport and sport, but I suppose it does add a layer of credibility there to all of them, that they almost totally independent studies, totally independent cohorts, and yet we almost end up with the same locomotor score and object control scores and overall fundamental movement skill scores. When we went on then and after the post-intervention testing, and I'm talking about FMS now, there was an improvement by both counties in relation to the locomotor. But the object controls, so things like maybe bouncing a ball and striking a ball with the hand and throwing and stuff like that, they didn't improve significantly. And I suppose the study out there will be that those skills do not improve unless they're addressed and unless they're specifically addressed. I think that's an important finding. People say, this is a cohort of 14, but 14-year-olds or whatever, or my child's never going to use throwing or whatever. But shoulder mobility would have a huge part of that, in terms of maybe if children were throwing a ball, would their shoulder mobility improve? If their shoulder mobility improve, would their ability to strike through a ball improve? And maybe down the line, would they have less shoulder-related issues? Now, again, it's very hard to do that without longitudinal studies. They've done it in Australia and America. We don't have it here, but in terms of the life course. But I just felt that was important to see that probably both of these, definitely we wouldn't have specifically addressed some of the object control, and there wasn't an improvement there. There was a huge improvement by both groups in locomotor specific skills, the running, the walking, the skipping, the jumping, and so on. But there was a statistically more significant improvement for the intervention group. So the work that they did specifically around fundamental movement skills and in their intervention meant that they improved to a greater degree than those who hadn't done that work. And they, as a result, the overall fundamental movement skills score, so that's all the scores included, would have improved to a greater extent with the intervention group than the control group. So, and then because these were a new set of tests, there was no baseline data for the sport-specific skills. But it was interesting to note that on top of that fundamental movement skill improvement, the intervention group also improved to a greater degree around the sport-specific skill of strike and the overall sport-specific scores.
Yeah, so a few bits to unpack there. First of all, we'll jump back to some of those original studies, Wesley's original White Pat, Brona's, Brona Grancy, White Pat following on. They were like all in or around 13-year-olds, first years in school in the Wicklow and then the Dublin areas. This is about 10 years ago. So I wonder if we replicated those studies in the same areas again, would object control have gone down further? And possibly that's why your cohort from playing sport maintained and there maybe drop off, particularly the non-sport playing players. But I don't know. That's
Yeah, I suppose the more recent one that I have there, like in terms of that, would have been Philpott and Kelly there, and it's interesting to note that Kelly's study says like that the optimum time for improvement in fundamental movement skills in children in Ireland is around the 3rd, 4th class level, and that is true. But it also shows that if we specifically work on them, there's still a window of opportunity to improve into the early adolescent years.
Yeah, I think anyone PE teacher or anything like that, even if they're coming into you not great, you can still get an awful lot of improvement in first and second year at some of them, provided you give it a little bit of time. That doesn't mean your whole class needs to be focused on throwing and catching. You can still do your little warm-up games and transition it into some Olympic handball or whatever that way. One of the ones that really jumped out to me was the low percentage of competence in hopping and jumping, and we've touched on this already, but why is that so concerning, especially in 13 or 14-year-old females?
Look, on a number of reasons, I suppose, and like again, this remains to be kind of proven, but the link there, like you're talking about the triple flexion of the, at the ankle, the knee and the hip, and that's involved in rising the ball. And we saw there, as I said, that girls, in order to kind of facilitate, they put in an affordance almost themselves by making the hurley longer so they don't have to bend as low to rise the ball. But the result of that then is the ball is going further into the air and it can be easily flicked away. So I would think that shows, that they're not all the time, but there was some issues there around mobility in those areas. And then as I go again and we're talking about conditioning, and I go back to my own story about the sheer number of ACL injuries and lower limb injuries that we have had. And a lot of them, I think, come from kind of those acceleration, deceleration moments, the changes of direction and the landing. And I think fundamental movement skills and just addressing the basic components that we're looking at there have a part to play in an overall approach. And I think, if you're looking at 9, 10, 11, 12, 13-year-olds, this is stuff that you can incorporate at the very beginning. It's beneficial. It's included into the warm-up. You can build explosive power and jumping up into the air. You have your pogo jumps. There's so many different things that can be done. But on top of that, you don't want to dilute it too much by playing maybe too many games, or by doing, so when I say games now, I mean fun games. You don't want to do too much of that, and you don't want to do too much drill practice either. But a nice blend of both of them, I think, is the way to go.
Yeah, like you need a little bit of getting better at the game. Like I said, I teach a sports pedagogy module, and we focus it around fundamental movement skills, and I try to show them the games, but you try and dip in some direct instruction or specific instruction where you just get to practice the skill without concentrating on being competitive, because when I get them to make up their own little games, they always finish with a race. You're like, oh, it's great fun. The execution of the skill probably isn't great here, but they're not supposed to get better at here. They're supposed to go away from the session having enjoyed what it is they did. It was the activity, it's activity 2 or 3 where you're doing that more direct, let's get better at a thing here now, and then go have fun again. Because they're not thinking of, they're hopefully getting better in that more applied part to instruction and improvement, but then there's still like the enjoyment bit at the end. So I think it, but like that's not just fundamental movement skills, that's the majority of skills you do across sports and all like that as well.
Yeah, like, I mean, not to be too technical, I mean, look at the Irish there, you have the girls that are playing the Aussie rules, and you have the lads at the American football now, and you have, a lot of girls in the last kind of transitioned out of sport into sevens rugby and back out. So there's a lot of, just because maybe the person, isn't the greatest camogie player or the greatest footballer, or maybe they are the best, it opens up so many windows in sport for them. And I often see the All Blacks when they come over there in the winter tests and they get a hurley and a ball and they're able to strike it with no real kind of bat and ball. They have their cricket background, I suppose. So there's a huge amount of, at times we can be quite, hurling, it's a fantastic game and skills like that. But with a bit of practice, and somebody with a good bit of know-how in relation to other skills, they can develop the skills. Like,
I was chatting to Jim McGann about this a few years ago. Like, I know he did his PhD on fundamental movement skills tied to gaming and stuff. But he was saying, like, an awful lot of the object control, it is just about putting processes together. And if you can throw a ball, it is putting together steps off, step forward, my left hand, reach behind my right arm, and release. Then when it does come to striking a ball, then, while it's not the exact same, it is still just the coordinative steps put together in motion and flowing from one to the other. And while if you just went and practiced, like I imagine if you looked at some tennis players, they'd come across really quickly to hurl, and even though it's a different implement and the stance is a bit different and you're facing a bit of a different way, they'd figure out the hurling strike really, really quickly, because they're just used to putting together steps and stuff, provided it's given a bit of time to practice. Like, even anecdotally, my wife here played for Kilkenny intermediate and a little bit of senior for Kilkenny, like, who's a good camogie player, and she can't throw. Just never ever once practice it. And even when we're out like playing with the children and stuff now, it's like, I just can't throw it. Like, the 3-year-old is better thrown than her. And then it comes across to the confidence side, she doesn't want to, because she's afraid, I'm bad at this, I can't do it. So I think it's how we layer up those skills then as well to build a bit of confidence. And if you can highlight to the players they're getting a little bit better at some fundamental movement skills, it shows them again that putting in a bit of time can also improve you at your more sport-specific skills, camogie in this case, but whatever their sport is.
And that was one of the key implementations that we had as part of the intervention. They would go home and practice some of the skills. So they would jump, and we'd ask them to place a post-it on the wall. How high could they jump and how far were they getting? So they could see themselves improving. Other things like striking a ball against the wall and throwing a ball against the wall, so they could actually throw the ball as hard as they want against the wall, because we had shown them how we wanted them to practice that at training. They were able to go home and practice it in multiple, and then we play a game inside which was a version of kind of Space Invaders or zonal type games, and it would involve throwing a ball and catching. And then we might take that into a game in hurling where it'd be a 4 corners game, and you're striking, camogie, 4 corners game where you're striking a ball to a player on the move and stuff.
Yeah, good to see the carryover to something practical then. I want to touch a little bit on the control groups. You mentioned there they did improve a bit at some of the local motor skills. Is that just because a lot of training is locomotor based in general, in terms of you're running around a lot and you might be coming from the winter time where you didn't do much, and there just is room for improvement in it in that type of, even the traditional training?
Yeah, Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, look, it was. I suppose it would be important, like, to see that the intervention and control, that both of them were improving, because they were both involved with sport at some level. So I mean, if we're not improving our skills across a 20-week window, even if they're secondary skills, and why are we do you know what I mean? I know there's the enjoyment side of things like that, but if you're not improving, are you basically after not achieving anything for the last 20 weeks? So I mean, it was important that there was an improvement observed.
And were you surprised at the smaller improvements in the sports specific skills in the control group?
In the control group, again, we didn't practice the three skills as assessments. The assessments were done on the first day, and they were never ever addressed again. Like, we did those skills, but we didn't do them as they were assessed. And they would have been very much the same. You know, they wouldn't have practiced them in the manner that we did, because they were very much kind of aimed at one person executing a skill at one time. So practically, you wouldn't be able to do that in a training session. So I suppose it would lead then to smaller margins of improvement as a result in the specific skill. Does that mean that their striking, overall striking, hand passing and jab lifting didn't improve? It probably did, but just in relation to the execution of these skills and how we had scored them at the beginning and scoring them the exact same way at the end, they hadn't improved to the same degree as the intervention group.
Do you think the sport specific skills improved from improving fundamental movement skills then, as opposed to the traditional training?
I think there was a certain leakage, yeah, in terms of that improvement, because how we would have addressed, so obviously the huge part of training, they were training with Camogie as well. So we kind of took a blended approach in relation to, they practice the skill in isolation. So they do a lot of striking to hand, 20 yards, and then we build it up, striking on the move and so on. And we look at how we plant our feet and a little bit of that. And then we take that on into a game and a condition game. But you're still, the main emphasis on the game was striking the ball. So it could be over the river or no man's land or something like that, but it was all about striking the ball and striking it over, so it wasn't landing halfway. So we addressed the specific assessment in that way, rather than actually teaching the test. And maybe that's the reason why the intervention group would have improved more at the striking. Which then would mean that the training was probably maybe more beneficial to them than just fundamental movement skill training on its own.
I wonder, is there just a little bit of a crossover as well in terms of, if you're given a bit of direct instruction around fundamental movement skills, do the players then just become a little bit more aware of body position, what they should be focusing on, and just that awareness transfers over into their skills? Even when they're back with their club and they're doing a bit of striking, haven't been instructed around fundamental movement stuff, or they're like, okay, well, when I'm striking, I should maybe bring my foot to here, or I should place my hands this bit there. Without instruction on that specific thing, does the awareness maybe help it? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know, because in the execution of a game, they probably revert to type and under pressure on that. But I suppose just some of the mechanics and freedom of movement, I'd call it. Do you know what I mean? We discussed there about throwing the ball, and if you don't throw the ball and you pick up one at some stage in your life, you know, you're going to be catted throwing it. And it's the same here. Where it mightn't be that they execute the skill that way all the time, but the more that we have practiced it in that plane, the more I think it'll leak into their overall, you know, striking of the ball. You know, you could look at some of the best players, and we've just the weekend after the All-Ireland, that they didn't spend loads of time probably doing fundamental movement skills when they were kids, but they did spend loads and loads and loads of time striking balls and striking them over the bar and striking them on the run and playing their own scenarios in the back garden or out in the field. So, you know, you're trying to incorporate that and encourage the girls to do that by recognising, you know what, it's not just about standing in the field striking a ball over and back. I have to strike it a number of different ways in a game.
Yeah, I have a few skill acquisition people coming on over the next while, so I'm going to make note of some of these bits as well. We can dig in and see what are some of the potential explanations around the crossover and the learning and everything that way. Are there any other bits then from the findings you think are worth digging into a little bit more here before we start looking at some practical recommendations?
Yeah, I suppose really the idea. No, I think I fairly well covered there. But I suppose it keeps coming back to the, you know, with the fundamental movement skills, I think, and it's skill in general. If we're not specifically practicing a skill, you know, if you're bouncing a ball, it doesn't mean you're going to throw it well. Do you know what I'm saying? You have to specifically practice to throw it. So when we're looking at fundamental movement skills and improving them, we have to look at it across, you know, each of the individual skills specifically. I know some of them couple together, like jumping and landing and catching and throwing, but we need to look at them as specifics. Are they catching the ball in the way that we like? Are we throwing the ball in the manner that they should be, and not just couple them together, because I think that's some of the problem when we're maybe playing a game, we're looking at throwing and catching, and they're the two skills. But were either of them addressed, or were they just reactions to the stimulus of the ball moving?
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think just even when you're designing your sessions, being intentional around what it is you want to focus on. And this could be skill based, it could be types of play based, whatever like that. That in a game, a load of things are happening. But your feedback, your observation, and your instruction should be focused around what it is you want to improve. So let's say, for example, you use a game of Olympic handball and you're focusing on improving throwing, and the movement off the ball might not be great, the throwing might not be great, all like that. You kind of need to park or just ignore that and focus on the throwing. You might play the same game a year later and your focus is actually on the movement off the ball or the side-to-side runs. Some of the throwing and catching might break down. You just have to ignore that and park it and focus on your observation and your instruction feedback on what is the movement off the ball actually like here. That's a really good point around focus on what it is you actually are trying to improve. Look at some practical recommendations here. Something you brought up early and I was thinking about when we were planning this out is, how can the improvements in fundamental movement skills or sport-specific skills tackle dropout in this critical age period in females?
I suppose there's a couple of things in relation to it, and from the skill acquisition, it's not just around competence and confidence in executing the skill. I think it's kind of developing an overall realization, in terms of, okay, well, this might be for me, but there's other sports there, and I'm sports motivated now because I can see that I can get better at something by working at it, and that's not just sport, that's in general. Like, we don't improve as readers or anything else if we're not practicing it. Like, you'd all hear people saying now my handwriting is disimproved, but we don't use handwriting as much as we used to. It's text and keyboard based, So I think that's important, and maybe some of the dropout is around the those age, like the Sport Ireland survey telling us when people drop out, there's the fun element of it, and I'm thinking about, but there's also the kind of self-perception as that I'm not good at this and that I move away from it. But I think getting into the mind of this is how I can get better at doing something and being motivated to improve by doing something can help in that manner, and also showing somebody that they can improve, they do by practice, can help. And it mightn't be that everybody isn't going to be an elite intercounty player at any sport or in the top 5%, but that's only the top 5%. There's 95% more underneath that you still want playing the game. So showing them and motivating them to be part of a group, and that no matter, there's so many different degrees of execution and people, the way that they strike a ball, it all needs to be incorporated, but just realizing that the way they're learning is as valuable as the person who's off with the top 5% with the development squads and county teams and so on.
Yeah, it's really good. And if we are looking to integrate more fundamental movement skill-based work into our typical sports coaching practice, so like our traditional training, how can we integrate it there? There are ways at every age, but how might it look differently as we go through the ages? Like, I'm thinking at under 6, like, I ideally want 4 stations, and one of them might be hurling or camogie and 3 of them are fundamental movement skills. But at senior intercounty, you're there talking about including more jumping and landing and hopping, so you're focused on fundamental movement skills at that senior intercounty level. How might it look different as you progress through the age groups, and even potentially at different stages of the year?
And look, I suppose his opinion, John, I'm absolutely no expert in this area. Like,
to be fair, I think it's a well-informed opinion.
Yeah, no, but like, I suppose, yeah, and definitely focusing on the fundamental movement skills, but not just saying we're playing a game for the sake of playing a game that involves jumping. That it might be 3 stations of jumping, and one of them is just looking at the jump in isolation. The next one might have them jumping over a hurdle, and the third one then might have them jumping over a series of hurdles in a relay. Do you know what I'm saying? That there's different levels of execution and giving them the exposure to all of them. So they're seeing, okay, this is how I actually do it. Because if you don't give them the first 2, what's the child going to do with the third one? Only probably knock over some of the hurdles, and then they're leaving and the whole thing is break down and the others are given out, and they're straight away, they're alienated at that even young age. So by giving them the chance at a really basic level to succeed to jump, then to succeed to jump over 1 before we start jumping over 2 and 3. Now, I'm not saying that that's the way we're going, but I'm just using as a progression continua up along and to develop the skill, and then we're becoming. So then you might take that on then with 8-year-olds, and they might jump over a hurdle, and when they're landing, you ask them to run and take steps and maybe build up where they jump over a hurdle. And it's not all about hurdles and SAQ here now. I'm just using it as an example. Maybe when they land, they run to the left. Maybe they land and run to the right. Maybe as we go up to our 11, 12, 13-year-olds, they're jumping over the hurdle, and now you're including some sports skill base where they're jumping over the hurdle, go left, go right, rise the ball. Do you know, so you have a change of direction, you have a jump, you have a land, and now you have an execution of a sports skill. So, you know, and that's just that. Maybe catching the ball, we're talking about jumping and landing. Maybe practice how do we land? Where are our feet when we land? Do you know, so we're just squatting and we absorb at the knees, or whatever cues you try to put on it. I wouldn't, you know, I think at the younger age, you'd be just letting them jump and getting used to it. And as they get much older, you'd introduce, because it's quite technical kind of looking at that. But I think it is important that you would address that somewhere around, you know, give them loads of chances to land, but maybe you might look at the actual technical things of landing and getting them more aware, self-aware of how they're landing at a later stage. And I think it, you know, you can be very, like you mentioned there, games of Olympic handball, you can use them, you know, your handpassing, your Gaelic football skills are easily implemented into a game like that, and hurling is the same as well, you know. One of the games that we would have used a lot is to try and make it was, we get the girls, they could travel 8 steps with the ball as opposed to the 4. So they're not worried about over carrying, they're not worried about soloing. You're removing those skills out of it. You're looking at support work, and you want them to support a player off the shoulder, or executing a hand pass, or striking a ball, so they can use their 8 steps to get away and then striking the ball in the move. Whereas if you don't have that, they're thinking after 2 steps, God, I have to solo now, or I have to take a catch. Then they get all flustered and they're surrounded by players. So try and open the thing up and say, okay, we're going to play it like Aussie rules now. You can take 8 steps with the ball, and refine that back down. Now you might say, but you're in the game then, what happens if you take 8 steps? They won't. From my experience, they won't. The first impulse they'll have is to put the ball in the hurley and travel with it. But just in the training, because we're not focusing on soloing, we're focusing on the striking of the ball on the run or the support work, that we tailor the game to focus in on those. Now, look, there's far better coaches than me than that, and I'm just thinking off the mark there now, you know.
No, they're good examples. Like I was looking at a couple of lads tweeting the other day about over constraining to change a behaviour early on, and that of allowing 8 steps, like it does try and change a behaviour. You're trying to get away from catching the ball and immediately put it on the hurl. Same as like, one I like to use in basketball is every pass has to be a bounce pass, because it forces the receiver to move into a space and not for looking for looping balls the whole time. Like sometimes I do that in a hurling, pretty on a little warm-up drill where they might be crossing over. You have to strike the ball into the ground and bounce it up. I don't really want passes like that, but I want receivers to get better at creating clear gaps for the ball to pass through. And no, I think they're good examples. For this research, you would look at like the TGMD2, the 12 fundamental movement skills. If you were to do, say, a less academic piece, or what you've learned from this, would you prioritise focusing on less fundamental movement skills, and what would they be if you were to do maybe a similar block with a development squad now again?
Yeah, I suppose this is kind of specific aficionados. In hurling, you know, we have maybe our dominant hand on top, and the striking in the TGMD2 necessitates the execution the other way around. So that was difficult, and we had to put that in affordance at the beginning, that we would tailor our scoring to allow them to strike it in the hurt, because they've done all their coaching up to that point, and you can tell them this is how you hold the bat and whatever. You show them an initial demonstration and so on. So like we did that and let them do that. So the reason I'm using that as an example is that some of the executions of the skills, you know, some of the points that you're looking at aren't the way that we might execute it in a game. So I think you'd be looking at that, like the jump and the land, for example, with the arms swinging and stuff like that. You know, that's very much the isolation move, or unless you're doing long jump in athletics, do you know what I mean, where you're bringing the arms into it and that. So I think depending on the sporting area that you're in, to answer your question, I think you'd tailor if you weren't doing any sport, I'd try and capture the assessment of as many of them as possible. If you are doing sport, maybe tailor, zone in on some of the ones related to your sport, both locomotor and object control ones, you know. Like one of the things that the catch, for example, is, you know, you catch the ball and it's like this. the instant reaction maybe to absorb the catch by pulling the arms back in towards yourself, So what they're still doing it right, but in the realm of the TGMD2, it mightn't be exactly the execution that they're looking for. And I think, that's something that testing and assessment, in my eyes, needs to look at. That, he caught the ball. Who are we to say that the way he has caught it is any more efficient than the way it's laid down in the test? Or inefficient?
Yeah, no, that's all good. And looking back at your intervention, if you're doing it again, would you do any bits of the intervention itself a bit different? Or were you like, no, very happy with that?
Yeah, I suppose it was an awkward window in that you were only getting them once a week. If you were getting them twice a week, you would have tailored the whole thing differently. You know what I mean? And zoned in on different skills and different practices. But like what we were trying to do was, and we knew that things might disimprove before they get better, because you were trying to do game related stuff. They were still training with their club. You were trying to do your fundamental movement skill intervention, and you were trying to tailor your game related stuff so that there was some improvement in those specific sports skills. Do you know what I mean? So I mentioned some of the games that we were playing there. We would have looked at scenarios as well where maybe there would be a ball in the end line and a cornerback is trying to get a ball out past the corner forward, and then you have somebody, maybe the fullback, moving off them in support, or a wing back striking to a wing back. That kind of stuff was hard to bed down, because they were coming from a different type of training scenario and training environment, and instantly they didn't see the benefits of it because it wasn't flat out. They mightn't have always been leaving the field sweating in the evenings, but that was kind of the approach. And I think we had to do that simply because we had them once a week. And if we focused in on, traditional training methods, as we call them, we mightn't see the improvement simply because we only had them once a week. So we needed to kind of jump to C before we addressed A and B.
The fundamental movement skill aspect of it, do you think that's potentially more suited to club training because they see them more often, and it would actually save you more time in county training to focus on the more gameplay stuff if you're doing all the fundamental movement stuff in club anyway?
Yeah, and look, you'll still do your jumping and landing and your hopping and your skipping as part of your warm-up, and can do that, the ankle mobility stuff and things like that when you're just jumping and hopping and skipping and lateral hops and so on. But I think it does embed itself, but it's very hard then to know, is it being done across the board? Is every club addressing it in that manner? Are they all looking at it different ways? Are they looking at it at all? And like we all look at the nursery and the academy, the nurseries. I think the nursery is the perfect platform for that, and probably should be focusing on that more than anything else. You said it there, that if you were doing it, you'd have 3 fundamental movement stations maybe, and 1 or 2 of the skills. And I think that's a really good place to start if we're doing that right, And
I'm always saying the one skill to keep the parents who are hurling or football mad happy. I would do it all fundamental movement skills based, or 6 or 7, but I'm not winning that battle anywhere, I don't think.
Yeah, I know. And look, I just, if you knew that everybody was doing that, and I think, look, as I said, it mightn't benefit them. They're not all going to become what, like, we all hope that are 24. Like, what's the hope when you bring your 6-year-old down to training? Like, what are you hoping for them? Is it that you want them to play adult with the club? Is it you want them to make friends and be active? I think at the beginning, the vast majority of them is to make friends, be active, being out, and it's a social element of it. So if we are, then we kind of need to remove some of our expectations that we put on them by turning them into All-Ireland winners at 6 and 7 years of age, and just give them the opportunity to practice skills, because, as we've shown, there's still a window at 13 and 14 to improve those skills if we approach them in the right manner. So I suppose that was one of the other things there. People would be always this concern, the window's closing, and once they get to a certain stage they can't improve. But we hope that looking at that there, especially when you look at the improvement in the intervention group in relation to their striking, had improved hugely. And as I say, they didn't practice that specific striking test at all, but their ability to execute it improved as a result of this, more so than the control group.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And last bit then, from what you've done, what do you think are the next steps in terms of research in this area?
I'd love if somebody went back and looked at it again when these were 18 years of age, or even looked at it again and did something similar whereby they were left with no intervention for a period of time and went back and looked again and see had that improvement been maintained or had it dropped off. I think that would be important. We didn't, like, this was a master's study, and because, as you said there, the amount of videos and stuff that had to be scored meant that we had to focus in specifically on the skills. But maybe the impact of multi-sport exposure and the impact of the growth spurt and PHV at that age, is there any impact involved there in relation to that? And what's the significance of that? Well, maybe we can kind of preach to our coaches to be more patient with the players at that 13, 14-year-old age group and focus their skill development slightly differently and say, look, there's a window to go back, but at this stage, this is what they need because their body is not growing in proportion to the skills that we're trying to get them to execute.
That's excellent, really good. And usually, like I say to people, I'll give an all hat tip now to your resources. Your resource online are top class. Like I've gotten and use quite a lot of them. Promote these here as much as you like, because more and more people need to see these and get on these and use them.
Yeah, look, I suppose came as part of this study at the beginning, just trying to make PE as accessible as possible for everybody, teachers and so on. So we put out plans there and schemes of work on it. PAM Ireland, PAM basically means physical activity and locomotor movement. PAM Ireland website and app and stuff, and using Twitter and just trying to make it as easy as possible and breaking down games, putting in instructions, and just as, we discussed there about focusing in on a fundamental movement skill. Well, how would I focus in on hopping? What games can I play for hopping? How do I play them? And just there are, not to be recreating the wheel or reinventing the wheel all the time, there are some fantastic resources across the board. I came across an absolutely brilliant one recently, only in the last couple of weeks. It was Special Olympics Australia. And you'd say straight away, but that's not relevant to me. But the games and the layout were absolutely brilliant. It's like the Move Well resource there in Sport New Zealand. Just they're using the tree model to differentiate and just looking at the continuum of they kind of introduce a continuum and how we can increase the complexity of the skill in a game through a kind of a continuum approach. I thought it was really, really good. And you're just constantly looking for that. I mean, I'm taking a career break this year, teaching, and I'm starting teaching PE to undergrads in Marino for a year. And I suppose I'd be trying to bring a lot of that kind of approach into the classroom with me, if possible. And I want to learn more as well as to what the undergrads teachers' attitudes are towards PE and how that governs their approach to PE when they go out into primary schools themselves.
No, that's all excellent. It's something I might get your back on at some stage. I'm always eager to dip in more into PE, primary PE, and the impact it has and the barriers there and everything. But that's a conversation for another day. Brian, that's been excellent. Thank you so much for coming on here. If there are any final words you want to wrap up with, go ahead. Otherwise, go jump back into some of these final tip celebrations and start looking ahead to the divisional championships.
John, listen, thanks a million for the opportunity. As I said, there's some people doing serious work in this, both at undergrad level and at, scholar level, I suppose you want to say, like yourself in terms of lectures and what they're bringing. And I think the whole space in Ireland is really improving. And I think it mightn't be this generation that will see the full benefits of it. But if we can make sure that the crew that are coming along now, starting at the under 6s and under 8s, experience it, that'd be great, and that's what we're looking for. And I think, there's definitely, like, PE now is going to 2 hours at primary level, and that's going to bring its own challenges but opportunities as well. And hopefully we'll see the benefits of that everywhere.
No, excellent. Thank you very much for your time, Brian.
Thanks, John.